Baron Friedrich von der Trenck. His very name is still shrouded in legend, imbued with an aura of romance, adventure, and unjust suffering. He was a brilliant young man from a noble Prussian family, an officer in an elite cuirassier regiment, nephew of Field Marshal Trenck himself, and a favorite at court. All doors seemed open to this 21-year-old charmer whose destiny appeared to promise only triumphs. However, in 1742, he committed the unthinkable, a daring and self-destructive act. He began a secret love affair with Princess Amalia, the younger sister of the all-powerful King Frederick the Great. This was not merely a fleeting flirtation, but an overt challenge to monarchical will, a violation of all unwritten laws of absolutism. Trenck instantly became not just a disgraced favorite, but a state criminal, a personal enemy of Europe's most formidable ruler. Within weeks, the inevitable occurred. He was arrested during duty and, without trial or investigation, thrown into the dark, damp dungeons of Glatz fortress. Thus began his tragic yet incredible odyssey through Europe's most notorious prisons, an ordeal that for posterity transformed into a symbol of indomitable will, desperate struggle for freedom, and the sacrifice of tyranny. However, it is time to cast aside this artificially constructed, sentimental myth. Baron Trenck was not so much an innocent victim of royal arbitrary rule as a calculating adventurer, a man who deliberately defied the system to elevate himself. His story is not only a beautiful tale of forbidden love, but also a harsh, uncompromising analysis of the price of ambition, the perilous game with absolute power, and how easily reality can be transformed into a convenient legend. To understand the true motives of this man, one must look much deeper than romantic fictions allow into the very origins of his formation. Friedrich von der Trenck was born in 1726 into the family of a Prussian colonel in a world where status determined everything. His lineage, though noble, did not belong to the highest aristocracy, those who truly turned the wheels of power and enjoyed unlimited privileges. This created a subtle but constant tension, instilling in the young Friedrich a sense of incompleteness, of inadequacy. Privileges existed, but they were not absolute. Recognition was present, but not total. In rigid, militarized Prussia, where every step was determined not only by rank, but also by ancestry, young Trenck grew up in an atmosphere where he constantly had to prove his worth, continually fighting for his place in the sun. Adding to this pressure was the colossal shadow of his famous uncle, Field Marshal Franz von der Trenck, a legendary yet highly eccentric figure whose dizzying exploits and notorious scandals resounded across Europe. For a young man whose own nature was prone to showmanship, to a thirst for exceptionalism, and an insatiable desire to be the center of attention, this became less a role model and more an unbearable challenge. He sought not merely to emulate, but to surpass, to eclipse, to become the absolute center of his own myth, outshining even the brilliance of his illustrious relative. This drive for grandeur, to be the most outstanding, became his primary motivating force. His keen intellect, remarkable charisma, and undeniable talent, for he was fluent in several languages, knowledgeable in literature and philosophy, and possessed refined manners, could not satisfy this deep, almost insatiable hunger for absolute recognition. Court life, full of intrigues, ostentatious glitter, and a constant struggle for royal favor, only intensified this feeling. Friedrich witnessed how quickly favorites changed, how easily careers crumbled, how ruthless power was, tolerating no rivals. And instead of playing by others' rules, he decided to rewrite them, to create his own game where only he dictated the terms. The point of no return was not so much the fateful infatuation with Princess Amalia as a conscious, calculated choice to play for the highest stakes, an act of absolute disregard for societal norms and monarchical will. He did not simply succumb to feeling, he decided to use this forbidden liaison as a springboard for unprecedented elevation, as a daring manifesto of his own exceptionalism and defiance. This was a challenge not only to the king, but to fate itself, a demonstration that his will was stronger than any prohibitions, that his ambitions knew no bounds. He believed in his star, in his invulnerability, in his ability to emerge victorious from any, even the most reckless adventure. This belief, bordering on pure overconfidence, shaped his character, predetermined all subsequent actions, and made him a hostage to his own grandiose idea of himself. He could not be otherwise. He had to be great, even if the price was his own freedom and safety. 18th century Europe was a minefield where the absolutism of kings and emperors encountered the first, barely perceptible cracks in the age-old system. This was especially true for Prussia, a state that Frederick the Great was building as a militaristic machine, an ideal mechanism of power that tolerated not the slightest malfunction. Here, in the heart of Central Europe, every aspect of life, from the economy to personal destiny, was subject to the single, centralized will of the monarch. The king did not merely rule, he was the state, his word was law, and his whim was a verdict. It was a world where honor and status determined not only one's position in society, but also physical survival, where every step of a courtier, every breath of a noble family, was under constant surveillance. The political climate was saturated with gunpowder. The Peace of Westphalia, concluded a century before Trenck's birth, had only temporarily stabilized the continent, but had not eliminated deep contradictions. European powers were constantly in a state of Cold War, regularly escalating into hot conflicts over territories, influence, and dynastic claims. Prussia, which had become a kingdom just a century earlier, was aggressively building its power, challenging old empires, Austria, France, Russia. Frederick the Great, himself a brilliant general and pragmatic politician, understood that his state's strength rested on unquestioning obedience, on an absolute hierarchy where anyone who encroached upon the royal will was considered a threat to the very foundation of statehood. In this atmosphere, any personal drama at court could instantly turn into a matter of state importance, and any intrigue into a political crisis. Prussia's economic background, unlike wealthy trading powers such as Holland or England, remained predominantly agrarian. The country's main wealth lay in land and its products, and state revenues came from taxes and military contributions. A powerful army required colossal resources, and this burden fell on the peasantry and small townspeople. The court, the high nobility, and the officer corps lived off this system, their well-being directly depended on royal favor and successful military campaigns. In such an economy, where personal enrichment and career advancement were closely tied to proximity to power, the stakes in the game for the monarch's favor were incredibly high. One wrong move, one act of disloyalty, could strip one not only of position, but also of all fortune, condemning them to poverty or exile. The social atmosphere was stifling and regulated. 18th century society remained deeply stratified. The nobility, especially the higher ranks, enjoyed privileges, but also bore a heavy burden of duties, primarily military service. Marriage was not a matter of the heart. It was a carefully calculated political and economic alliance, a tool for strengthening the lineage, accumulating lands, and forging connections. For a princess, the king's sister, this principle was elevated to an absolute. Her fate was part of state policy, her marriage a strategic alliance. Any infringement on the princess's freedom of choice meant not merely a breach of etiquette, but an undermining of foundations, an attack on the sacred order, consecrated by centuries of traditions and dynastic interests. In such an environment, where everyone knew their place and deviation from the norm was mercilessly punished, Baron Trenck's daring liaison with Princess Amalia was not just a romantic transgression, but an act of political terrorism, capable of exploding the fragile balance of power. This world, harsh and merciless, simultaneously provided the stage for Trenck's grand scheme and determined its tragic consequences. The casemates of Glatz seemed destined to swallow Friedrich von der Trenck forever, but for him, prison became just a new stage where he was to enact another, the boldest of his schemes. He had no intention of accepting his fate. Instead of despair, his sharp mind immediately set to work, analyzing every corner of the fortress, every habit of the guards, every opportunity. He quickly understood force would not help, but cunning and corruption would be his main allies. His gaze fell upon Sergeant Schell, a man burdened by debts and a large family. Trenck, possessing an astonishing gift of persuasion and an equally impressive supply of gold, began his game. He offered Schell not just money, but a new life, full of prosperity and freedom in Austria, if he would help him escape. This was not merely a bribe, but a meticulously planned psychological operation, turning a jailer into an accomplice. Thus began the first of his major schemes, the escape from Glatz. For several months, under constant surveillance, Trenck and his recruited sergeant methodically dug a tunnel from the casemate, using primitive tools made from improvised materials. Every piece of earth, every speck of dust, was part of a grand, risky plan. In 1746, on Christmas Eve, the decisive moment arrived. Trenck and another prisoner, Lieutenant Friedrich, whom the Baron had forced to join the escape, broke out. A sentry blocked their path. Trenck, without hesitation, engaged him in a struggle, disarming him. Then they fled, crossed the border into Bohemia, and from there into Austria. This escape was not merely an act of desperation, but a demonstration of his incredible ingenuity, cold calculation, and willingness to take any risk. It showed that Trenck was not a victim, but a player who, even when trapped, was capable of turning the tables. However, freedom for Friedrich von der Trenck meant only the beginning of a new, even more complex game. In Austria, Prussia's rival country, he hoped to find refuge and perhaps even take revenge on Frederick the Great. He joined the Austrian army, attaching himself to the Pandurs, irregular troops known for their brutality and effectiveness, once commanded by his uncle. Here, far from Prussian prisons, Trenck quickly proved himself a brave and skilled officer, rising to the rank of Rittmeister, captain of cavalry. He was again at the center of events, in a whirlpool of wars and intrigues, but the shadow of the Prussian king did not release him. Frederick the Great, obsessed with vengeance, never ceased his attempts to retrieve the fugitive, sending demands for extradition and spreading rumors of Trenck's double-dealing. It was here that the second major scheme, or rather its fatal imitation, unfolded. Trenck, attempting to leverage his position and notoriety, engaged in secret negotiations with Prussian emissaries, perhaps trying to bargain for a pardon, or, as his enemies claimed, offering his services as a double agent. He navigated between two great powers, playing on their mutual distrust, attempting to profit from his unique borderline position. However, this risky game turned against him. In 1749, while in Danzig, a city with a special status and under Prussia's unspoken influence, Trenck was arrested. Formally, this occurred at the request of the Austrian authorities, who may have succumbed to pressure or themselves suspected him of treason, but in fact, Prussian agents were behind his detention. His attempt to maneuver between two fires to use his reputation as an adventurer led him into a new, far more terrifying trap. He was once again a prisoner, but this time he faced not a quick return, but long decades of oblivion in the darkest dungeons. The grim walls of Magdeburg Citadel, where the Baron was transferred after his Danzig arrest, became not an end for him, but merely a new, extreme training ground for refining his unique methods of survival and manipulation. Here, in one of Prussia's most impregnable fortresses, Trenck once again demonstrated that his true strength lay not in physical might or desperate resistance, but in his capacity for profound psychological analysis, virtuoso manipulation of human weaknesses, and phenomenal adaptability. He would immediately scan his new surroundings, identifying the system's vulnerabilities and those who operated it. His gaze fixated not on locks and thick bars, but on the faces of the guards, on their habits, on the slightest signs of discontent, greed, or hidden ambitions. Trenck didn't just speak, he wove an intricate web of words, penetrating the interlocutor's thoughts, adapting to their worldview. His magnetic charisma, honed in Europe's glittering salons, now became a tool for influencing prison staff. He didn't offer a direct, crude bribe. He painted visions of a future where a guard, weary of the monotony, poverty, and bleak prospects of service, could find freedom and prosperity beyond the Prussian Empire with the support of Trenck's influential patrons. He played on their fears, their desire for a better life, their secret resentments against a ruthless system. His choice of instruments, the people he drew into his schemes, was strictly pragmatic and ruthless. He did not seek heroes or loyal friends, but calculated who was on the brink of despair, who could be broken, bought, or blackmailed. Sergeant Schell from Glatz was an ideal example of such a choice. Burdened by debts and a large family, he presented a perfect target to whom Trenck could offer a solution to all problems, transforming him from overseer into accomplice. This was not a naive belief in the goodness or honor of people, but cold calculation, the ability to find the deepest hidden motivations and turn them into levers of his own influence. Trenck knew how to identify experts in corruption, discontent, and the willingness to risk for great gain, turning their weaknesses into his assets. He masterfully created an aura of exceptionalism around himself, even in complete isolation. In the depths of his casemate, Trenck managed to maintain his reputation as a man with incredible connections, a possessor of secret knowledge, a player always one step ahead of his pursuers. This was a subtle yet extraordinarily effective form of buzz that made not only his cellmates, but also some of the jailers perceive him not as an ordinary criminal, but as a figure capable of changing their own destiny, or at least becoming a source of valuable information. He spread rumors, hinted at secret plans, creating an atmosphere of intrigue and anticipation that sustained his influence and ensured he was not forgotten. His personal capacity for adaptation was astonishing. Trenck didn't just survive in inhumane conditions, he transformed them into his arena for further machinations. No tools for escape? He fashioned them from everyday materials, using the smallest details of daily life. Lack of information from the outside world? He built a complex network of rumors, observations, and subtle manipulations, forcing guards to unwittingly share information. The monotony of prison life? He turned it into an opportunity for in-depth planning and honing his mental abilities. He could spend hours analyzing the minutest details, anticipating his opponent's moves, calculating possible outcomes, like a grandmaster on a chessboard, for whom each new prison was just another puzzle to be solved, a new barrier to be overcome. This inner flexibility, multiplied by boundless, almost pathological overconfidence, allowed him not only to survive, but to continue his game, even when physically he was completely immobilized and deprived of all privileges. He was not broken by cold, hunger, loneliness, or torture. He used his suffering as an additional tool, as part of his personal legend, which was meant to evoke sympathy in some, or, conversely, intensify fear and respect for his incredible resilience in others. He was a master of improvisation, capable of instantly changing tactics if the initial plan failed, and turning defeat into a new starting point. Ultimately, it was this unique combination of personal qualities, perspicacity, magnetism, ruthless pragmatism, phenomenal adaptability, and the ability for total manipulation that made Friedrich von der Trenck not merely a prisoner, but an eternal threat to those who sought to break him. He was not just a victim of tyranny, but also the architect of his own incredibly dangerous destiny, always ready to turn the tables, even if it meant risking everything. His long years in prison, full of desperate escape attempts and secret intrigues, were merely a continuation of his grand game, in which he was the lead actor, the director, and the sole highest stake. However, behind every one of Trenck's attempts to turn the tables stood the one who was himself a master of this deadly game, dictating the rules with absolute, unquestioning authority: the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great. His figure was not merely a symbol of monarchical power, he embodied a new type of ruler, an enlightened despot whose genius as a military commander and statesman was combined with ruthless pragmatism and an almost pathological need for absolute control. Frederick built Prussia as an ideal military machine where every cog, from the lowliest peasant to the highest aristocrat, had to serve a single purpose: to strengthen the power of the state and of himself, the king. In his view, any deviation from this strict line, any manifestation of individual will not sanctioned by the crown, was perceived as a threat to the very foundation. This is why Trenck's case became for Frederick not merely a domestic incident or a romantic transgression. It transformed into a personal challenge, an insult to his authority and family honor. The liaison with Princess Amalia, his younger sister, was not only a breach of dynastic plans, but also a daring encroachment upon the sacred, the inviolability of the royal house. For a king who himself had endured intense pressure from his own father, the soldier king Frederick William I, and had been forced to subordinate his personal aspirations, including his love for music and philosophy, to rigid state interests, Trenck's act was an unforgivable demonstration of defiance. Frederick the Great, for all his enlightenment, remained deeply vengeful and would not tolerate anyone daring to play by their own rules on his territory. He could not allow this audacious young man, who had defied his will, to go unpunished. Each of Trenck's escape attempts, each of his intrigues, only fueled the royal rage, turning his imprisonment into a personal vendetta that lasted for decades. Princess Amalia, whose name is inextricably linked to the beginning of this drama, was more an unwitting participant, a pawn in someone else's game, rather than an active player. In a world where royal marriages were exclusively instruments of grand politics, her personal feelings held no significance. She was meant to secure dynastic alliances, to strengthen Prussia's position. Her liaison with Baron Trenck, regardless of the depth of her feelings, was an act of political sabotage. For Frederick, her fate was part of the state mechanism, and any disruption of this order was regarded as an attack on the stability of the entire system. Amalia, caught hostage by her own feelings and Trenck's ambitions, ultimately paid a high price. Her subsequent life was filled with solitude and disillusionment, and her name forever remained etched in the scandalous chronicles of the royal court. Beyond the formidable figure of Frederick the Great, other influential forces, patrons, and beneficiaries participated in this complex game, their interests only complicating Trenck's fate. The Austrian court, a long-standing and irreconcilable rival of Prussia, readily used the fugitive as a valuable resource. In Vienna, Trenck was not merely a disgraced Prussian, he became a potential source of information, a symbol of Prussian arbitrary rule, and, most importantly, a tool for destabilizing their enemy. His enlistment in the Austrian army, his service with the Pandurs under his uncle's command, and his rapid career advancement to Rittmeister all were part of a carefully considered Austrian strategy to weaken Prussia. They granted him patronage, but their support was purely pragmatic. As long as Trenck was valuable, he was safe. As soon as his usefulness was questioned, as happened before his arrest in Danzig, he became a bargaining chip. It was here that the full cynicism of the political game became apparent. The Austrian authorities, perhaps under Prussian pressure or due to their own suspicions of Trenck's double-dealing, sanctioned his arrest in Danzig. This proved to be a fatal trap for the Baron. Accustomed to skillfully navigating between interests, he became a victim of the very system he sought to exploit. His attempts to conduct secret negotiations with Prussian emissaries, bargaining for a pardon or offering his services, were perceived as betrayal by both courts. For Vienna, he became an unreliable element; for Berlin, merely confirmation of his perfidy. In the end, Trenck, whom both sides used as a tool in their grand chess match, became a hostage to his own cunning, caught between a rock and a hard place. His uncle, Field Marshal Franz von der Trenck, whose reputation was already tarnished by numerous scandals and eccentric escapades, was also drawn into this intrigue. Although his influence on young Friedrich was primarily psychological, shaping his ambitions, Franz himself might have been an indirect beneficiary of his nephew's notoriety. The scandals of the younger Trenck only added to the existing aura of the mad Trencks, maintaining a unique, albeit controversial renown for the family name. However, Franz, himself an adventurer, ultimately faced the wrath of Empress Maria Theresa, spending his final years in prison. This underscored the universal danger of playing with absolute power, where even the most influential figures could lose everything overnight. Thus, the fate of Baron Friedrich von der Trenck was not merely a story of personal drama; it became an arena where ambition and treachery, lust for power, and the yearning for freedom, monarchical tyranny and desperate resistance, collided. Each of the key players, the ruthless King Frederick, the unfortunate Princess Amalia, the pragmatic Austrian court, even the eccentric uncle, pursued their own objectives, and Trenck, in attempting to manipulate them all, found himself at the center of this merciless game. His life is not only a tale of incredible escapes, but also a harsh reminder of how easily one becomes a victim of one's own ambitions and a pawn in others' far grander political intrigues.